good to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. Thank you for having me.
No,
Uh,
and thank you for agreeing to be here as well. So I'm really excited to discuss your choice, your book choice, which was really amazing because I hadn't come across it before. So it was really interesting to read that. And obviously, like we've had a few discussions over the week, and we were just like, wow, actually, there's so much that came out of it that was really relevant
yeah,
to both of us.
yeah, it's a really powerful book, and I think for me, I mean, I'll probably say it later, but it's such a hopeful book. Because I work in this world, so I work in the trauma world as a research assistant, and I've worked in it for sort of 6, 7 years. And when I first got into it, everyone was like, "You must be crazy. That sounds like a depressing world." But I think you slowly learn actually it's quite hopeful. And I think this book sums up really well because that's quite new research the book's based on. So yeah, very hopeful.
Definitely. And, so I'll do a brief introduction of the lovely Annabel Lovegrove here. So, she's a stress specialist and a research assistant for a non-profit, which actually focuses on childhood trauma. And she can actually be found on at Thoughts on the Brain. So do check it out. And the book that you've chosen is obviously Donna Jackson Nakazawa, who's actually written, she's a science journalist and she's written quite a few books already, but this one is The Angel and the Assassin, which is a really fascinating title anyways. But she's also the author of three previous books exploring the intersection of neuroscience, immunology, and emotion. So this is like quite a really hefty book in terms of exploring a really important neuroscience topic mixed with psychology. So this was a real find, actually. So I've got to ask you, first of all, so what drew you to the book?
Work, really. So I do a lot of reading for work, and then obviously I'd come across her work before, but I was sort of looking for a really good introduction to microglial cells, which is the sort of cell that this book talks about. So we came across it at work, and I do all the reading for everyone and kind of highlight the stuff we need to read. And yeah, it was just a fantastic summary of the research. And I mean, she is obviously very good at writing, but it is just very, very well written. So a joy to read. So yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's really quite eye-opening actually reading that. And so what do you think were your main takeaways from the book anyways?
So I said at the beginning, but I think hope. I think you learn from the book that there's so much research out there around psychiatry, such new research, especially in the sort of last 10 years for microglial cells. It's really in the last sort of 5-ish years. So it's really hopeful to see that there's so many things on the horizon in terms of treatment. I
Mm.
think, that's one thing. I think another thing would be for people who have chronic health issues. I'll explain it a bit more probably later, but for people who have chronic health issues, this particular cell, microglial cells, provides again a lot of hope. But actually, don't give up if you have a chronic health issue. Really, I think is what I'm trying to say here. I think I personally had a chronic health issue, and I had something similar to sort of mast cell syndrome, which is sort of when your mast cells go a bit crazy and start releasing histamine and stuff like that. So it's sort of an autoimmune issue. And I think it can be really, really hard not to give up, to lose momentum, if you like. And I think this book actually gives a lot of hope there. And it teaches you actually, if you keep going, you keep asking. And I know here in the UK, especially with the NHS, when you have something which sort of falls between the cracks, it can be really difficult. But if you keep going, eventually you will find someone who knows this research or perhaps might take a special interest in your case. And so, yeah, this book really affirms that. And then I also, just tying onto that, I would say you also know yourself. So throughout the book, the author, she gives a few different case studies of people that she follows. And I think it's really interesting to see how all the women, because it's mainly women she talks about, all the women, they seem to have this narrative. And this is so common, especially in my line of work, you see it, where they say, I knew something was wrong and I knew something wasn't right. And people might have parred them off. So they'd be like, oh, maybe I'm wrong. But they all kind of said, no, I knew. So I think, yeah, you know yourself. If you think something's wrong, pursue it.
Definitely. And there were so many examples in the book where she was talking about people who were just desperate for answers and had been looking for like years and years. And then there was just this moment where it was just really quite hopeful. And so I have to ask, so obviously there's been very little research between our immune systems, inflammation, and our brain generally. And, obviously medical schools have made this assumption that, our brain just could not generate inflammation and it was immune privileged, which is what's when mentioned in the book. And I think, why do you think this is the case? Why, there's just been such little research in these kind of connections between these different areas of the medical world?
So I think yeah, she mentioned it in the book, but mind-body dualism. So this is the whole idea that most researchers, think of Freud. I think he believed in this too. Quite a few well-known researchers, it's starting really in the 1700s, 1800s, had this idea that the mind was separate from the body and they needed to be treated differently. Now, because we, if you like, now we would maybe call that bias, but because we have that idea, all of our research really sort of fit into those two silos. We were looking for research that could confirm this, or we could look at research to confirm that the brain didn't have an immune system, didn't face inflammation. And in all honesty, because of that, we never really started to look for reasons as to actually maybe they are one and the same, or maybe they do heavily overlap, I think, as we would say now. And I think because of that sort of bias, we didn't have enough research to confirm that. Now, obviously, as this book sort of illustrates, in the past I'm going to say 10 years, but really in that last 4 years, we've started to actually say, hang on a second, I think we might have been wrong here. We've had some really amazing discoveries around, we have a lymphatic system, which is sort of when our white blood cells in our body take away dead cells. So it's called our lymphatic system. It kind of is, if you like, it's a bit like our blood vessel system, just separate. And we always thought that our brain didn't have any of those. And in fairness, they were really hard to find. So I think people looked all over the brain, never found them. And it was again, I think in 2013 that researchers found, it is mentioned in the book, researchers did find that actually we do have those lymphatic vessels. They're just very well hidden. So because hidden, it's very easy to understand how actually we just didn't really connect the dots. Yeah, and I think also with the brain, inflammation on the brain doesn't look like inflammation in the body.
Yeah.
So, when you get inflamed, I think people, for instance, with eczema, like I have eczema, when it's inflamed, it's probably red and hot. Whereas inflammation on the brain, you won't see that. I mean, you can't see the brain, that's also a problem.
Mm.
But I think because inflammation looks different, so even when we have been able to see brains, we've just said, well, they don't look inflamed.
Yeah.
Now know that they don't look the same when they're inflamed. It's more about actually our biochemistry that's going on. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. No, and you're right. It's been hidden for so long because we just don't look at it unless there's like some major issue, and then the medical professional will have to actually look into it rather than just sort of be like, oh, this
Yeah.
is psychosomatic or something like that. So, what you're mentioning is microglia is obviously the huge part of this book, which is a cell, and and it's still not very known in the sort of the mainstream outside of sort of neuroscience, outside of the neuroscience sphere. And so why do you think this is the case? Because obviously this is like a breakthrough kind
Yeah.
of sort of discovery in terms of finding this connection between this cell that has the ability to be an angel and an assassin and sort of create lots of different issues. So why do you think it's really not out there at the moment?
Yeah, so the thing with research, right, and this is across the board, not just in this particular research, it probably takes about 10 to 12 years for research to come out in clinical work. Now,
Right.
that's really annoying, but it is for, especially in clinical work, in psychology or neuroscience, it is a good thing because it means everything that ends up being in the clinical work has been tried and tested a million times. So that's good. Unfortunately, in some cases, it does take too long. And I think with something like this, so this sort of research, so when this book came out, or the research that this book is based on came out, it really was groundbreaking research, and it's what we would call research which might sort of instigate what we call a paradigm shift. So it's like it's completely changed how we view a certain type of science completely. So it's amazing. It's like fundamentally amazing. So it's so exciting, and so many doors have opened. But the thing with those paradigm shifts, because we've had many in the past, is you just need to be really careful that you don't jump the gun. Now,
Mm,
research that's coming out is all confirming exactly what they think and what is talked about in this book. So we're pretty sure that it's all correct. But
right.
and you need to just make sure, especially because it's so far reaching. I mean, she
Yeah.
demonstrates it well in the book. I mean, you go from talking about mental health disorders to, in young people, to Alzheimer's and older people, to diet, to microbiome too. So the microglia cells have a role in all of those interactions. So that's a lot. Um,
Mm,
so yeah, it just takes time. Um,
yeah. Yeah, which obviously, it is obviously hard for some of us who are obviously dealing with it, but it's still good news going in the right direction, which is, definitely something. And so in your opinion, so what do you think about the possible link between sort of these cells and different mental health disorders and conditions? Because obviously they do sort of touch upon, like she does touch upon the fact that, there seems to be some kind of link happening.
so a very strong link. Um, I personally think there's a very strong link. I mean, the research also confirms that, or is starting to confirm that. I would say, first off, they clearly have a huge role. So, just to explain a bit about microglia. So, what they think is happening with microglia, originally they thought these cells were just sort of like if you like, the cleaners of the brain. So, if a cell had died, a neuron had died, they just clean it up, which they do, in fairness, but they actually do a lot more than that. So, if something gets tagged as rubbish, and that it can be, for whatever reason, if you've got significant inflammation, let's say, lots of things might mistakenly get tagged as rubbish. So, these microglial cells, if you like, go on an absolute rampage. And as you can imagine, that has dire consequences. So, whilst that is huge, I mean, if you think about that in your head, you think, my God, that's mind blowing.
Yeah.
It is quite literally, no pun intended, but there are also other things to consider as well. So, we do need to consider the diet that someone has, the genetics they have, the environment they've grown up in. So if you like, she talks about trauma and the role that it might play with microglial cells. So there's that interaction. So there is a hugely strong link as
I'm
well
sorry.
as thrown in.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm sorry. A stupid motorbike just went by. Sorry, apologies.
I'm surprised I haven't had that yet. Uh, yeah, so no, there's a hugely strong link, and I do think it's such positive. I've said at the beginning, but it's such a positive direction that we're going in, and I think there's so many opportunities here for new treatments that really can
Yeah.
change lives, especially those who've had seriously complex mental health disorders. So yeah, a very strong link. Um,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was really just quickly saying hello, Charlotte, who's below, and she's written an amazing book as well. So definitely worth keeping an eye on her book too. But we were talking about Donna Jackson Nakazawa's book, which is The Angel and the Assassin, and the microglia cells that could have contributed to a lot of sort of neuroscience issues, like brain issues, and also mental health disorders. So, we're talking about the potential link, and actually more and more research coming out that's really showing this is actually happening. So, why do you think we see physical health issues as legitimate and not mental health? Because that's always been a major problem in terms of, this sort of this medical industry where unless you see like an actual impact, which is in a way a good thing that the microglia cells is there, because it's now sort of proving that. But before that, it's been very much like, oh, it
yeah,
doesn't matter.
no. So I think the first and foremost one would be, we sort of touched on this earlier, but you just can't see mental health issues. So it's, if you're a doctor and you're faced with someone who has a huge cut on their arm versus I think I feel a bit depressed, you can see which one they're kind of going to lean towards first and foremost. Now, that isn't a criticism of doctors. You can see how that happens. Anyone would do that. Even if you've had a loved one who's had a mental health disorder, or struggled with something like that, you might not notice it for a while because you can't see it. So there's that problem. I also say there is a social sort of cultural thing going on here, which I'm sure many people would agree with me here. I grew up with parents who probably would be in the baby boomer generation. Yes, they are. So they are a kind of that post-war generation where, to be honest, so my grandparents, their parents were very much in that sort of state of survival, at least here in the UK. where they're like, we just need to survive. We don't have a war going on now, so we need to celebrate. So we don't need to, life is already great. We don't need to indulge people's emotions. We don't need to make sure life is even better. We are just surviving, and that's great because we're alive. And I think that really got passed down with that sort of baby boomer generation. And I think sometimes they obviously get a bad rap. I think people are like, oh, they don't understand emotions, which I would say isn't true. But I think, they just have such a, cultural habit of not talking about them. So
Mm.
for them, the whole idea of mental health disorders is really hard to grasp, especially when, so I have a grandma who's about to turn 100.
Oh wow, gosh,
She was talking about the things she's seen over, the past century. And she
wow.
blows your mind because my grandma she grew up in Canada, and she went from getting a sleigh to school to suddenly she now has an iPhone, and she's like, you just can't believe it. She's like, I still can't believe it. So I think it's the attitude of you can't get your head around that, because you've suddenly
Mhm.
serious shift in how people treat what we now call mental health disorders. And I think if you especially start to think of the trauma world, which again she touches on really nicely on this book, our research that only really started to gain momentum so we started really studying it in the world wars. It then dropped a bit, and then in the 1960s it started to pick up again, and then really the 1980s and 1990s is where we started to say, hang on, we think psychology and biology overlaps here. So we just haven't really established that sort of, actually they are both really important, and actually they're very much interlinked. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Definitely. I'm like, it's crazy, isn't it, that so much has changed. It's fascinating to hear that your grandma is 100 and she's seen so much sort of change. I mean, even in our own lifetime, we've seen so much change. It's kind of fascinating. And so, how do you think sort of stressful environments? Because obviously, she mentions, the microglia cells is very much like impacted by outside external environments. So how do you think it impacts our mental and physical health in general then?
So how do stressful environments affect our mental and physical health? So hugely. So this is obviously an area I do a lot through work. So say for instance, we're going to call it childhood trauma here. So if you have a lot of stress as a child, now there's certain windows which she doesn't mention in this book, she alludes to, but there's certain windows in childhood that vary depending on the person, depending on their genetics, their environment, but called sensitive periods. So these are windows where biochemically you're a little bit more vulnerable than most. For if you suddenly have a stressful experience, then you tend to be more influenced by that. And when I say influenced, I mean quite literally your brain architecture, so how your brain is structured, it might be really influenced by the events. So if you grow up in a really stressful environment, and I think this book really nicely talks about this, you might find that actually you end up in sort of a chronic state of stress. And what that might mean is that actually these cells called microglia start to go a little bit haywire and start to break things down when they shouldn't. And I think there's a really nice, and she talks about it with a lady called Seaburn Fisher briefly. There's a really nice paper, which I think I have shared, but I'll share again after this, where a guy called Martin Toscher, who I've worked with, who's at Harvard, he shows this really nicely. And this is microglia now, we've confirmed doing this, where if you've grown up with adverse childhood experiences, what we've called them, you quite literally, your brain, so the highways of your brain, we call them the highways, so those are sort of the most used neurons, aren't really connected to the front part of your brain. So that's your prefrontal cortex. So that's like things like decision making, emotional regulation, anything like that to kind of stay balanced. So if someone's experienced ACEs, they're not really connected to the front part of that brain. And they are, but they don't have any super highways, as we like to kind of call them. And I think stressful environments in childhood, it can be really life changing. But we now know that actually the reason why they don't have that connection is microglia at one point or another didn't allow that to happen, or if it had happened, broke it down. So yeah, I think your environment can have huge impacts on your physical health, huge impacts, especially because we know now that, which is nicely demonstrated in this book, that your mental health has a huge impact on your physical health and vice versa. So yeah, originally we thought they weren't really connected, but now we know that's really not the case.
Yeah, definitely. There was that example of the woman who just really struggled to make decisions because, she was just overwhelmed, like almost overwhelmed by everything. So yeah, it makes total sense that, it's like shut down a part of her brain
Yeah.
in that way. It was really fascinating to read that. And then her getting that special, I think, special trans electromagnetic,
Stimulation. Yeah, yeah.
yes, that's right. To try and sort of regenerate almost some of it. Fascinating, like really quite like wow, like I was really surprised. I was just like, I've never heard of this, and this is just amazing. But
Yeah.
how do you think, we can kind of close this gap between psychoanalysis, I think human suffering, and
Yeah.
neuroscience?
So human suffering, for those who don't know the definition, it's anything like Alzheimer's. It's anything like autism can fall into that category. So any sort of mental health disorder, at least in this case. Now, obviously there is a huge gap, and before we said that obviously research takes time to fall through to clinical work, which is understandable. But I think we do definitely need to close that gap. And I think we're now seeing that actually new treatments are coming out, kind of like the transcranial magnetic stimulation that we just mentioned. And I think what it really takes is for people to show interest in this stuff. So if you read about this stuff, I would really ask your GP about it. If you feel like it might be fitting for you, obviously work with your GP, they'll know best, or your care provider, whoever. But I think asking for this stuff shows researchers or clinicians that actually there is a demand for this stuff and it could help. That helps to sort of, if you like, fasten or quicken the pace for the stuff to pull through to clinical work. And I think bearing in mind too that actually we have this tendency to sort of say, oh well, stuff like talking therapies won't work, or people, especially if they read this book, they might think that. But I want to make sure that actually that really isn't the case. So, and she does say this, luckily, at the end, but the combination of the two. So if you bring new forms of treatments that are based on neuroscience, so stuff like QEEG, which is talked about in this book, which is
Mm,
a form of neurofeedback. So that's sort of it's going to sound really strange, but it's where you wear different sensors on your head to measure your brain waves. And
mm,
what they know is that certain brain waves are associated with certain sort of mental health disorders, or sometimes not even mental health disorders, just certain sort of performance issues, maybe, so attention and focus.
mm,
So train your brain to actually perform better, if you like, or perhaps be a bit more emotionally regulated, if that's the sort of aim of you want. So we have all these amazing new technologies, but combining them with old technologies is what we're now trying to do. Uh,
mm.
Being aware of that connection too, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really good idea as well, which is just to sort of look into it and, ask your GP. That's a really interesting idea. I do wonder whether they're aware of it because, I've got a neurologist, I have a consultant neurologist, so I'd be really interested to see whether he is aware of this kind of procedure. So yeah,
I
especially
think
in the UK.
Yeah, I think often they are probably aware of it, but I think just by someone bringing it to their attention, they're suddenly like, oh, actually, hang on, people aren't really asking for this, so clearly this must be actually a thing. And I know it's
Mm,
so silly, but I personally have seen it with GPs where I've done the research for my own health issues and gone to them with what I've read, and they're kind of like, oh wow, actually, I knew this was a thing, but I didn't realize people were now asking for it or actually be something or very useful. Yeah, yeah.
definitely. That's so fascinating. So I've got to ask you, what was like the most amazing fact you came away from this book? Because obviously, the microglia is in
Yeah.
itself is an amazing fact, but like, was there any other tidbit which you were just like, this is like mind blowing? Again, no pun intended.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I so I this isn't new fact for me per se, but I think I've never heard someone say it so eloquently as she did. And actually the way she said it, it was something like, wow, that sounds a lot more impressive than anything I was for. But she sort of talks about how, and I think this fact for me at least was really useful to, because I do some clinical work, and I think it's a really useful way of explaining to people that actually things like depression that you might have or anxiety weren't your fault. Then it's not like something's like it's not like you're doing something wrong. And the way she explains this is we obviously have a stress response. So everyone will probably know this. You've probably heard of this at some point. It's fight or flight. So, or fawn or freeze can also be added to that. So we've had that and we still have it, and on the, if you like, on the plains of Africa, or when we were fighting predators, that was a really perfect response because we suddenly needed to fight or we suddenly needed to fly or freeze or whatever. Now, I've heard that explained, and now in modern day life, that response isn't so ideal because actually we can get stressed by things where we don't need to fly. So, say for instance, I sometimes get really bad stage fright, and I think it's a funny one for me because I know all this research, and I'm like, I know it's not like these people are going to attack me. I know they're not, but I still sometimes get that moment where you just like, I need to leave or I need to like prepare, and it doesn't make sense logically. So you might have known that, and again, that pulling it through to modern life, it's not useful so much. But I think another bit of it, which is often left out, and maybe this is just the new research, but I have never heard so well explained, is so that your fight or flight is mainly taught in a bodily response. But actually, your brain, we know now through these microglia cells, has an immune system. So the fact that it has an immune system is mind-blowing to start with, but the fact that actually we've realized that when we go into fight or flight, your brain also goes into fight or flight. Obviously your emotions do too, so that's your brain, but more in an immune sense. So what that means is your brain is then like, hey, look, we need to prepare, let's send out a lot of inflammatory markers to tell
Mm.
sort of reduce activity, and just everything's become inflamed, so it makes you want to rest and feel a bit depressed actually. Now, when you are fleeing from a predator or fighting them, if you got scratched, your body would say, well, hang on, I might get an infection now. So actually the brain response was telling yourself, okay, we're going to be depressed. We're going to want to just sit still. We're not going to want to do anything because we're going to use all our energy to heal from this wound, let's say. Now, that made a lot of sense again on when you were fighting a predator, but now that doesn't make sense. And I think for me, the interesting part or the great explanation of that was it makes sense that actually the things like depression, a modern day equivalent, I would say, is if you've ever had a bad flu and a couple
Mm.
of days after you still feel pretty low or really lethargic and really tired, but you're like, I feel better, but I feel really sort of down. Now that's the modern day equivalent, and it has a point. It makes sure that you heal and rest, and that's really useful. Except for the fact that if we get that stress response a lot in modern day life, and then we get that depression side of it added on top, that doesn't really make sense. And because we now face a lot of like new pathogens that we didn't face before, so sort of like imagine exhaust fumes and stuff like that, we're actually getting bombarded a lot of the time by pathogens that our brains like, hang on a second, we need to rest here, we need to really make sure we need to heal. And whilst that's great in theory, or oh, my internet cut
But
out,
then
I think
you're
I'm
back.
back.
Yes.
It's not really useful for modern day life. So it's, yeah, for me, I probably didn't do it justice there, but I think it's really interesting to see that brain sort of depression side, which doesn't often get talked about with fight or flight. So yeah. Mm.
Definitely not. And I read more and more about, say, the polyvagal theory, and it definitely kind of feeds into that idea of like your bodily reactions to stress and anxiety. So it's so interesting because there is just more and more connection coming out between the mental and the physical side, which is really important, I think, for the long run for everyone, because maybe there's like hope for so many people out there. So, with that being said, if you had to give it, a rating out of 5 stars, what would be your rating?
Oh, so it is a really good book. I mean, I feel like I've talked a lot about some of the science, but all of this is in the book, I promise you. And it's not as overwhelming as it might seem. She really breaks it down nicely. I would say then, uh, really, I mean, it is a really good book because I've read a lot of science books, and actually, this is the one which has probably been the most eloquent that I've come across. I would say a 4.5 out of 5. The reason
Nice,
I
nice.
say 5 is
Yes.
um, as a reminder to take everything with a pinch of salt. Whilst it is
Mm.
all fully researched and backed up, there are many. The thing with science is you sometimes turn another corner and you're like, oh my God, wow. So there's always something to bear in mind with science, and that's always a good thing, but it means
Mm.
there are lots of surprising things too. So yeah.
No, you're 100% right. Yeah, and it totally agree in terms of make sure you do your research and make sure you get your here's a disclaimer. Make sure you talk to your health professionals and things like that. But it is a fascinating book, you've heard it here. It's really interesting because it is changing so much about what we know about our brains at the moment. So thank you so much, for your incredible insight and also your suggestion, Annabelle, honestly.
Oh no, thank you. Honestly, and anyone who's seen this, I really highly recommend it because especially if you have a chronic health issue, it will give you, firstly, so much hope, uh,
Yeah,
give you perhaps maybe just a new way of looking at a problem you have, and I think that is so invaluable. So yeah, pleasure.
definitely. Definitely. So thank you so much, Annabelle. And hopefully, please come back if you have any other
I will.
suggestions and great books and stuff. We'll definitely try and do this again because it's very interesting. So huge thanks, Annabelle.
No, thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Excellent. Well, see you. Have a good weekend, rest of it, anyways.
See ya. Bye.